Chapter 13 of The Wheel of Fortune by a Self-Made Man. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 13, in which Bert finds out that he has been a chump. "Where did you get those bonds?" asked the broker on whom Bert called the next morning and offered the Canadian Pacific securities for sale. "They belong to Captain Staggerback, of the British Army, who has taken a room at the place where I board. He had to go to Trenton early today on business, and as he needs the money, he asked me to sell them for him. Well, we do not purchase bonds unless we have a reasonable assurance that they belong to the person offering them." "What is your name?" "Bert Hawley." "Where are you employed?" "With John Love, publisher, number 34 South 9th Street. "How long have you known Captain Staggerback, who you say gave you these bonds to sell?" "I met him for the first time yesterday." "Well, I will give you a receipt for these bonds and send a messenger with you round to your employer. If he will vouch for you, I will give you the market price for the securities." Mr. Love, who had just arrived at the office, told the broker's messenger that Bert was all right, but he asked his young canvasser how he came to get the bonds he wanted to sell. Bert gave him the gist of his interview the previous evening with Captain Staggerback. "It may be all right, Bert, but I'm bound to tell you it looks a little fishy. It seems to me the captain has had time since the alleged theft of his pocketbook to sell the bonds himself, if he is pressed for cash. The man is an entire stranger to you. He may have stolen the bonds, or gotten them from the real thief, and if such should happen to be the case, he is simply using you as a cat's paw to get rid of them without risk to himself." "Do you really think so?" asked Bert, clearly startled by the supposition. "I do not assert that it is so, Bert," replied Mr. Love, "but I know such tricks have been worked upon unsuspicious people, and I noticed the report of a case almost identical which is printed in the Ledger less than 3 months ago. I should advise you to be cautious. On the whole, it would be safer for you to tell the captain that the broker refused to deal with anyone but the principal. You say the landlady loaned Captain Staggerback $100? Well, that ought to carry him over until tomorrow, surely, and then he can go in person and dispose of the securities." "I think you're right, sir. I don't want to take the risk of getting into any trouble over the bonds." "That's right. Go back to the broker, ask him for the securities, and return them to the captain. You may tell the broker that I advised you to do this." Bert hastened to carry out his plan, though he had an idea he should feel a bit ashamed of his caution if everything turned out all right in regard to Captain Staggerback. A surprise, however, awaited the boy at the broker's. "We have discovered that these bonds are a part of a batch of securities stolen from a New York banker a week ago," said the money broker, consulting a printed slip he held in his hand. "A detective will be here in a few minutes, to whom you can tell the particulars and furnish as accurate a description as possible of this Captain Staggerback, who I have no doubt is a clever crook." "Good gracious!" gasped Bert. "Don't be alarmed, young man. We have no doubt of your innocence of any attempt to deceive us. The rascal simply took advantage of your unsuspecting nature." Bert was staggered to think that he had been acting as an agent for a thief, or maybe his accomplice. "And I thought I was too smart to be taken in by such a game as that," muttered the boy in a tone of disgust. "I guess I haven't cut my eye teeth yet." In the course of 15 minutes the detective appeared, and Bert was subjected to what he considered a most humiliating interview. "You needn't be so cast down, Hawley," said the detective. "Pretty clever people are fooled every day by the simplest of methods. In fact, the more innocent-looking the scheme, the easier they tumble into the trap." "But I can see a dozen reasons now why I ought to have suspected Captain Staggerback," replied Bert, feeling as if he wished he could have the pleasure of kicking himself. "That's because you now see the bogus captain in a different light. He simply had you hypnotized last night." "Hypnotized?" "It amounted to the same thing, didn't it? He persuaded you to do something which, under ordinary circumstances, your common sense would have stopped you from doing. He talked you into believing he was all he represented himself to be." "That's what he did," admitted the boy. "He just worked me into the Queen's taste, and I hate to think what an easy proposition I was." "You'll have your revenge after we have landed him in jail, and you are called upon to identify him. I'm afraid Mrs. Morgan is likely to lose the $100 she loaned him at my request." "It is probable she will." "No, she won't," spoke up Bert with a sudden resolution. "I'll pay it back to her myself. She wouldn't have let a comparative stranger like him have so much money on such doubtful security as a certificate of mining stock if I hadn't asked her to, and showed the bonds, the proceeds of which I believed would fully secure her in any case. I shall stand the loss as a lesson to be more careful in the future. The certificate of mining stock is not mentioned among the securities stolen from the banker. It was either lifted from somebody else or it is worthless. I fancy the latter to be the case, as there is a lot of that kind of stuff floating around. Mrs. Morgan was very much disturbed when the detective called upon her that morning and opened her eyes as to the true character of her new lodger. "I ought to have insisted on having a reference when he came here. He was such a smooth talker and had such a distinguished air that really I was persuaded he was perfectly respectable. So the man is really a thief," she added with some indignation as she thought of how she had been taken in. "He is certainly what we call a crook. That is, a professional criminal, madam," replied the detective. "So he told you he was going to Trenton and would be gone all day?" "Yes, on business of great importance." "I imagine he hasn't left the city. He will probably turn up this evening in the expectation of receiving the $500 or thereabouts from the sale of those 5 bonds. If he does, I shall be on hand to make his acquaintance." "And do you think I will get that $100 back which I lent him?" asked the widow anxiously, for the loss was a serious one to her. "I'm afraid there's little chance of that, so far as he's concerned. However, don't worry about it. Your young boarder, Mr. Hawley, told me he intended to make your loss good, as he said it was through him you were induced to part with your money." "What, Bert?" "Yes, I think that's his first name." "Oh, I wouldn't think of taking it from him, sir. He's the nicest young man I ever had in my house, a perfect little gentleman. I don't hold him responsible for it," she answered with some warmth. "You must settle that question between you, madam. I think you had better let me see that mining stock certificate." Widow Morgan got it from her bureau drawer. 5,000 shares, eh? Jumbo Gold and Silver Mining Company of Cripple Creek. Offices of the company at 13 Trentmont Street, Denver, Colorado. Handsomely engraved, isn't it, madam? But I don't believe it's worth the paper it's printed on. I'll take this with me and communicate with the Denver authorities. If the company is not a wildcat, as I strongly suspect it is, we shall probably be able to find out if this certificate has been reported to the company as lost or stolen, in which case we will be able to trace its rightful owner. Captain Staggerback failed to turn up at his lodging place that night, and the detective's presence in the house failed of results. In fact, nothing further was heard of the so-called captain. To account for this, we may well inform the reader that the brilliant captain had just been a little too smart to be caught. Instead of going to Trenton, which had never been his intention, he simply removed his mustache and whiskers, made a few other simple changes in his attire after he left his lodgings that morning, and then waited until Bert came out. He shadowed the boy down to his place of business, waited until he reappeared on the street, followed him to the broker's, saw him leave that place with a messenger, and then began to scent trouble. He hung about, however, until Bert returned, and as soon as he saw the boy was detained at the broker's office, he was satisfied that the game was up, and he took the first train out for New York. Bert drew $100 from his savings bank and insisted on Mrs. Morgan accepting it. She strongly objected, much as it meant to her, but the boy would not take no for an answer, and she finally yielded the point, declaring that Bert was everything that her fancy could picture. A month later, the jumbo certificate was returned to the widow with the information that there was no evidence that it had been stolen from anybody, that while the mine was a genuine one, the stock had no market value, and had never been quoted at higher than 1 cent a share when first exploited. Mrs. Morgan turned it over to Bert, who put it away in the bottom of his trunk as an object lesson for his future guidance. End of chapter 13.